call the first speaker of the day, Mr. Tim Cheyne from Integer Research. Tim is the Director of Environment and Emissions at Integer and is responsible for the company's work on the diesel emission sector. This covers, of course, stationary and mobile emission control technologies and related chemicals like AdBlue and so on. He has worked closely with OEMs, engine manufacturers, suppliers, oil companies, and AdBlue suppliers to develop market forecast, strategy, investment assessments, and other key business issues. And is covering a wide area. So although I think the office is in London, in general, there are offices in Detroit and Taiwan as well, and has previously worked in engineering design, operation of petrochemical plants, and commodity market analysis. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Penny. And it's such good to see such a good full room this morning. Welcome if you haven't been with the conference until today. And I hope you have a very productive day or two from here and tomorrow. Yesterday was outstanding in terms of the presentations. I certainly enjoyed everything I heard, and it was very instructive to hear some updates from key stakeholders on heavy duty and non-road emissions regulations and OEMs. Today we have an interesting combination of events on offer. We have in this room, as Penny described, some really good discussion on the future potential for developments of regulation. If you're wondering what's happening next door, we have the fifth seminar in our roadshow for the European fuel industry, tailored to fuel industry operators, so filling station owners effectively, helping them understand what the implications are of Euro 6 diesel cars, AdBlue infrastructure. So that's a kind of separate event, but if you're interested in attending that, it starts at 10:30, so just check with registration to see if there's any space and if that's possible. At 2 o'clock, I believe we have a demonstration of Euro 6D temp, so RDE compliant Euro 6 cars. We have 5 manufacturers which have those cars on demo in the car park, and that's going to be along with a demonstration of the latest AdBlue filling connectors and filling packaging and dispensers. So if that's interesting for you, I'd encourage you to join that demonstration at 2 o'clock. And then we have a cocktail where everyone can combine later outside the front, where we'll be able to have some drinks and watch the football, if that's interesting to you. So that's just a bit of infrastructure for you. It's some logistics for the day to make sure you can plan your time in the most optimum way. Turning now to my responsibility for the morning. I'm going to be giving an introduction discussion, but we're going to do things slightly differently to what we normally do. We're going to make this much more interactive. So this week, my kids were actually telling me that I look like Gareth Southgate. Do you know Gareth Southgate, the England manager? I think maybe it's the beard, but I want to channel Gareth Southgate today. So I'm actually put my waistcoat on because I know the England team don't normally do very well, but this is my best attempt at channeling Gareth Southgate. So far, they've won both games, done very well, so that's been a really good team effort. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to try and coordinate an equivalently good team effort with you. And by that I mean we're going to do an interactive audience poll of some really key issues. So it's quite a light-hearted start to the day, but it's got some serious undertones, of course, and it addresses some of the key issues that have come up yesterday, and they'll come up today. So I've got a fine assistant at the back. Ben is running the technology, so we're going to get that up on the screen. But absolutely everyone has to join this. So I'm the manager today. You've got to listen to me. I've got the team sheet. You're all in the team. So I need you to get your devices, your laptops, your mobile phones, whatever you have, and load up the web page called voxvote.com. Everyone has to do this. It's only going to take 5 minutes. Voxvote.com. So get your Wi-Fi connected if you haven't got that connected. And then you can see the URL at the bottom. It's live.voxvote.com. I need you all to be on this because there's going to be a survey, and if you're not involved, you're going to be noticed. And I'm going to point you out from the front. Okay, so who's got live.voxvote.com on their phones, on their laptops, on their tablets? I want more. I want more hands than that. Otherwise, this is not going to work very well. Live.voxvote.com. Once you get to that screen, you'll need to enter a meeting number, which is 35165. So live.voxvote.com. It's a free website. There's no app to download. There's no login required. There's no security implications. It's a really simple system, very clean. Nothing downloads to your device. Live.voxvote.com, PIN 35165. Are we ready? Not yet. Can't log in. Don't log in. The URL is live.voxvote.com. No login required. Just enter the PIN. Penny, are you in? Yes, you're in. If you've got a black screen, if you have a black screen with a kind of purple button at the bottom, you're in. Let's wait, then you're in waiting mode. So let's do our first test. Question number 1 is on the screen, just a simple test question. What do you do? What does your organization do? It should be running. This should come up on your screen. Are you with the commission, regulated government, any kind of government organization, or a vehicle engine manufacturer? Or are you a technology supplier, some kind of emissions control device supplier? Or are you with fuels and AdBlue fluids? Or finally, are you some kind of service provider to the industry? So I want you to enter your answer to that question. This is going to test to see how many of you have engaged. Okay, very good, very good. We've got about half the room, I'd say, so far logged in. Keep going, keep going. We need probably more than 100, I'd guess, from the audience. Keep looking. Live.voxvote.com. The PIN is 35165. Okay, interesting. So we have a really good mix of people here. And I guess the first thing to say is any conclusions from these results would be not the most scientific, so don't read too much into them. This is not an audience that's been selected for their independent views. All of you are experts in your fields. You'd probably be European experts or global experts, so your opinion is very interesting. And we'd like to see what that balance of opinion across those segments means for some key questions that I have to pose for you. Okay, we get into the 100 mark, so we're getting closer. Keep going, keep going. Live.voxvote.com, PIN 35165. Okay, let's press on. Next question, please, Ben. The first question is, what will oil prices be in 2025? This is a simple question, just to see if you're thinking. Don't think too hard, just your gut feel. What do you think oil prices in 2025 are going to be? Really low, like less than $30 a barrel? Oil touched almost $30 a barrel about a year ago. Maybe even May last year. The year before, actually. $50 a year last year and have gone up by about 50% since last June. We're currently at what, $75? So the last year has been almost continuous increase in oil prices, driven by some uncertainty from the Trump administration, the whole Iran situation. There's been supply constraints in Libya and different places. So oil is quite tight at the moment. Do you think it's going to get tighter? $100 a barrel in 2025 equates to about $93 in current dollars. If you're an economist and you like to think of nominal and real money. So put your numbers in. Do you think it's going to be at the current level, roughly, or oscillating between 30 and 100? Is it going to be high, like 2012 numbers, above $100, or is it going to be really low, like less than 30? The reason I've asked this question is because I've been trying to think about the disruption or the unexpected outside effects which could change the outcome on some of the emissions regulation discussions, some of the emissions technology choice discussions. And I think one of the externalities to that whole situation is oil prices. It came up in the discussion yesterday in some really interesting questions. One or two of the OEMs were asked whether they thought high oil prices would be facilitating or helpful for future CO2 targets and fuel efficiency targets. And I think the speaker said they thought it would. Obviously, higher fuel prices reward fuel efficiency. So they would certainly help. Low oil prices would be probably counterproductive, you'd think. But I don't think anyone, no matter how clever they are, has any idea what oil prices will be in the future, given how the world is looking more and more uncertain. I think most people would have thought oil prices would have been lower than they are today. So who knows? But let's see what the audience thinks, Ben. Okay, so we kind of middle of the road in this group. We think oil prices are going to be kind of oscillating around the current level. I know it's a pretty wide band, 30 to 100, but it's probably covers most scenarios that people plan for. However, almost a third of you think that oil prices are going to be high, above $100. That's in an environment where we're doing everything we can to actually reduce fuel consumption. So that's an interesting, quite bullish conclusion. Maybe you think OPEC is going to get more successful with their coordination. There's talk about Russia joining OPEC. That could be interesting. On the other hand, you've got the US fracking industry still in overdrive, so that's going to push prices down. Anyway, who knows? But I do think it's an interesting thing to track, and I'm sure in your own assessments you track or you think about oil prices quite carefully. So thanks for those answers. We're nearly at 100, so if you haven't logged in yet, live.voxvote.com/35165. Please log in. You can even use 2 devices. Cheating's allowed. Okay. Next externality I want to think about is battery costs, because battery costs are quite fundamental to the future of powertrain. Certainly will determine the pace of change. Even regulation can't overcome economics to a great extent. I look back at even as recently as 2010, the forecast for battery prices in 2025 by most commentators was as high as $1,000 per kilowatt hour. If you track things more recently, you'd think that batteries are probably costing around $150 per kilowatt hour just for the cells before they get built into packs. Tesla's announced they're at about $190. There was an interesting confirmation from GM that they're buying batteries for $145 per kilowatt hour from LG, but that's just for the cells, so you've got to add a bit on to make the packs. But we're around the $150 to $200 mark today. Most people think that for full electric vehicles to be competitive, batteries need to be below 100. Again, some people think that's going to be achieved by 2022, 2025. Some of the other commentators we follow say 2030. Woodmac is thinking like 2028. They're one of the key consultants that track this stuff. But really, batteries need to be more like $50 per kilowatt hour to be competitive, or even less to be competitive on heavy duty. But let's see what you think. So do you think batteries will be less than $50 per kilowatt hour by 2025? 50 to 100, which is that sweet spot for many applications, certainly light duty. Or do you think they're going to still be quite expensive by 2025 and make the whole electric vehicle thing quite difficult? We've got most of the votes in. Again, I guess, as expected, most of you, more than half of you, think batteries will be quite competitively priced, less than $100 by 2025, which will allow electric vehicles, electric cars certainly, certainly wouldn't allow heavy-duty trucks. Heavy-duty trucks doing long haul need about 800 to 1,000 kilowatt hours of power of energy in the battery. So at $100, that's $100,000 of battery. At $50, that's $50,000 of battery roughly. That's a lot of money on a heavy-duty tractor, semi-tractor, or a heavy-duty truck. So I think there's a long way to go. Looking at the numbers, though, talking to a colleague at Benchmark, a company that tracks battery costs, he was telling me yesterday that battery raw material prices are going up quite sharply. The metals and the chemistry in batteries is getting more expensive, but it's been more than outweighed by the economies of scale. So the scale effect is outweighing that cost effect. But he speculated that a lot of the early gains have probably been made on the scale effect because there's some pretty big battery factories around. And his feeling was that the pace of battery cost reduction is going to slow down. It's going to become more difficult to keep making those gains on battery cost savings. Still a long way to go from 150 to 200 down to 50. So it looks like we're pretty divided in the room. Some people think it's going to be really low, less than 50. Almost a third thinking it's going to stay above 100. Fascinating stuff. I guess the conclusion from those numbers would tell me on average in the room, we expect passenger cars and light-duty vehicles to be quite dominantly battery by 2025, or a big share, a reasonable share. At those prices, in this room, we'd expect heavy-duty not to be fully electric by 2025. Okay, this is going well. Are you all involved? You engaged? Okay, let's move on. Another controversial question coming up is, looking at the light-duty segment, will diesel cars be banned from driving in many European cities by 2025? There's lots of press on this. It's quite a popular thing for politicians to be saying. But do you think that diesel cars will actually be banned? And I don't mean complete vehicle bans. I know some cities are going pedestrian, no cars whatsoever. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a ban that distinguishes diesel cars from other vehicles. Do you think that there will be many European cities, Paris, London, Munich, Frankfurt, Madrid, that have by 2025 completely banned all diesel cars, including Euro 6 RDE compliant vehicles. Do you think that's going to happen by 2025? That's not very long, 6 or 7 years away. Is that going to happen in that time frame, or do you think that the RDE regulations and the investment by manufacturers is going to yield effects and convince people that vehicles are clean enough? So pop your answers in. Right, Ben, let's see what the view is. I don't know what this is going to be, to be honest. Okay, right. 2/3 of you think no. You think that the industry is going to make a strong enough argument to convince politicians not to make that big decision. 1/3 of you think that it will. That's going to be quite dramatic if that happens. It certainly will affect the way transport happens, the way people buy cars if they can't drive their diesel cars into the center. I guess we're all expecting restrictions on Euro 4s and 5s, the ones that have been known to perform badly. But I guess the new vehicles are the ones that are going to have to be carefully considered. Okay, let's move on to the next question. It's a related question, perhaps more fundamental one. And just to frame this question, I think there's a wide range of views on the future of diesel in the passenger car powertrain mix. We're forecasting about a quarter of diesel will still be a quarter of cars in Europe will still be diesel by 2030. So we're quite bullish on diesel as a share of the total. We saw a really interesting presentation by the powertrain head of Honda in our conference in Tokyo two months ago, and he was sharing some information on on Honda, who are of course not strong on diesel and quite aggressive on alternative powertrains. Honda's view of the future, and he shared that Honda's plan is to have 35% of all their vehicles globally in 2030 still having internal combustion engines, so pure internal combustion engines, no hybrid. They're planning for 2/3 of vehicles to be electrified. So of those, of the whole groups, 2/3 to have some measure of electric, either full electric or partially electric, which means a fair share will be combined with combustion engines as hybrids, which means about 85% of Honda vehicles in 2030 will still have some form of combustion engine. 85% of Honda vehicles. I thought that's interesting as a kind of benchmark, a company that's as bullish as you can probably get in terms of moving to electric. Strong presence in Japan. Already 20% of their vehicles in Japan are hybrid or electric. So that's the one end of the extreme. But of course, you have European manufacturers, US manufacturers that have a different perspective. So the question here is, what share of European car sales in 2025 will have a diesel engine? And I've given you some options here. You can go very pessimistic, say diesel's going to get almost phased out. Less than 10% of cars will be diesel by 2025, all the way through to more than 50. So some resurgence in diesel sales. I think they've dropped to about 45% currently, and anywhere in between. So pop your votes in, stick your votes in, put your opinion on the line. Let's see what the conclusion is, Ben. 20 to 30%. So that's a moderate decline. Is the biggest answer, but there's again quite a big range of views there, centered around 20 to 30%. So that remains a big share of a big number of vehicles sold still in the 2025 timeframe with diesel engines. Okay, we're going to change gear now to heavy duty and look at a few issues more to do with the heavy duty end of things. Before we run this survey, well, you go ahead and start it, Ben, but don't give us the conclusions yet. I wanted to just summarize some of the conclusions from yesterday if you weren't in the presentations. Of course, there's a big push in Europe on heavy duty to have a focus on CO2 and fuel efficiency, and we know that the determination and declaration of CO2 and fuel efficiency is already a requirement for manufacturers from the 1st of January next year. And just recently, the Commission's put out their proposal, which we heard about in detail yesterday from Dr. Steiniger and from Georgios Fonteras from the Commission, and the response we had from some OEM speakers was very interesting. The proposal is for 15% reduction in CO2 and fuel efficiency by 2025 based on a 2019 benchmark. So well more than a percent a year of improvement, more like 2.5% of a year of improvement. And then again, another 15% reduction from 2025 to 2030, based on the 2019 benchmark, with the possibility to review that target midterm, so 2022. So there's a really aggressive, ambitious roadmap there, which the Commission's proposed and is under discussion. I think that makes Europe the most ambitious globally in terms of fuel efficiency reductions, because, of course, Europe had high fuel costs before any of this happened. So there's been commercial pressure on OEMs to reduce fuel consumption for some time. And as some speakers pointed out yesterday, some of that technology has actually been used in the US for the first phase of greenhouse gas regulations. That's technology that was introduced in Europe purely to help customers save fuel. So that pressure for that, if that regulation is largely unchanged and confirmed, then that's going to put some enormous pressure on manufacturers to adapt their product. All the OEM speakers said yesterday that that requires more than just business as usual, more than current technology. There will need to be serious adaptation of product, especially medium-duty products shifting to hybrid or battery electric. Heavy duty is going to have to change too. Some speakers yesterday had a view on this particular question, but I'd like to know what you think. So can you tell us, do you think that diesel engines will remain the primary propulsion, the main powertrain for heavy-duty long-haul trucks, the biggest share of the truck industry in 2030? It's a long way away, but it's the end of the Commission's proposed regulation. So do you think that heavy-duty will be diesel, more than 90% in 2030, or no? You think that diesel is going to decline and not be the main powertrain option? ASEA had before we make this live, finally, ASEA had an interesting seminar a few months ago looking at future, they called it future powertrain options. And the message from those speakers and from the industry, ASEA's side of the industry, was that diesel will, for the long term, be the main driver, the main propulsion, the main engine, the heavy duty driver for the long term. They didn't see any change to that. Even natural gas seems to be less prominent in some of the discussions. Okay, let's see the conclusion. What do we think? I'm a bit nervous. What's going to happen? Okay, so quite dominantly, the audience thinks 85% is going to be diesel by 2030. That's a long time away. Thank you very much. 15% of you think that there's going to be some quite fundamental disruption to heavy-duty powertrains. Let's move on to the next question then. If you don't believe diesel is going to be that successful or that dominant in 2030, then I'd like to know what you think will happen. So two quick questions. The first is battery. Do you think that battery electric vehicles will achieve at least 10% of heavy-duty vehicle sales by 2030? So this links to your previous question. Do you think full electric trucks heavy-duty trucks will account for more than 10% of vehicle sales by 2030? Put your views in there. If you think yes, if you think battery electric is going to develop, battery costs are going to drop, and there's going to be quite an important share of heavy-duty trucks running on pure electric charging and infrastructure, put your answer in. If you think not, then say no. Okay, Ben, let's have the answer. Similar share. I think most of you think no, it'll be less than 10%. About 20% of you think yes. That's quite a big share of a group. I think a lot of you are involved in probably in diesel engine technology in some way, especially emissions control. So that's an interesting view. Thank you. Second question, related question, I guess. If it's not going to be battery, is it going to be hydrogen? We had a really good presentation from Giorgio Katsamakakis yesterday from Hydrogen Europe. I'd encourage you to look it up. It was in the non-road segment yesterday, but covered on-road. Very interesting perspective on hydrogen as a fuel, especially for heavy duty. He mentioned the obvious advantage of hydrogen being extremely dense as an energy carrier, very effective as a way of providing energy for electric vehicles. So do you think that hydrogen fuel cell technology will be at least 10% of heavy-duty truck sales by 2030? I think Hydrogen Europe would say yes. I think companies in other countries would say yes. Nikola, Georgia mentioned Nikola, the company in the US that's developing a hydrogen fuel cell semi-tractor. You probably follow that development. They've been running that project for probably 2 years now, getting quite far down the track. They've just recently confirmed 800 tractor sales to Anheuser-Busch. 800 tractors expected to be delivered by 2020. That's a lot of confidence in the technology. I'm not sure if that can be achieved. If you take Tesla's delays as anything, you probably say not. It might be longer than that. And the infrastructure and the cost of running these vehicles is not that clear. The models I've seen from Nikola don't make don't have as much clarity as you'd like in terms of a payback period. They've bolted or bundled the fuel cost in with the vehicle, which is unclear really in terms of the practicality of running those vehicles. It might be a reasonable launch strategy, but it doesn't seem viable for a long-term business plan. Yeah, I think we'll see. Well, I just saw in the news this week that Nikola's actually suing Tesla for patent infringement for $2 billion. So if anything's going to distract Nikola from doing what they should be doing, developing trucks, it's going to be a legal case like that. Anyway, the company's working hard at hydrogen fuel cell trucks. So do you think they're going to have at least 10% of the share of heavy-duty truck sales by 2030? Let's see, Ben. No. Okay, but probably more. The audience here is more bullish about hydrogen than full electric as a solution for heavy-duty trucks. I think that's probably a reflection of the current pricing of the options and the level of technology development. So I think that's a reasonable assessment. Let's move on. Linked to the CO2 and greenhouse gas regulations is the question of what happens with emissions criteria pollutant standards. And it's something that Penny, I know, looks at, and it's one of the discussions that's going to come up later today. Many of you are looking at whether there are options for something beyond Euro 6. I want to focus in on the NOx standard because there's an interesting situation developing in the US, which is a kind of discussion that's in some way informs opinions around the world as to what's possible. In California, ARB launched their voluntary NOx standard in 2013, I think it was, which allows manufacturers to certify vehicles at some voluntary low NOx standards. So the EPA 2010 standard is 0.2 grams per brake horsepower hour, isn't it? Whereas the California ultra-low NOx optional standards are at 0.02, 0.05, and 0.1, which is like a 90%, 75%, and 50% reduction. So those standards are very aggressive. Came in quite early. CARB does like to lead the way on these things. And there have been quite a number of engines certified on those standards, even on the 90% reduction standard. But to my knowledge, they've only been, and they've not been diesel engines. I think they've all been natural gas or other fuel-based engines. But the technology is being developed, and there's funding going into developing in exploring technology that can achieve diesel engine technology that can achieve ultra-low NOx standards. CARB's quite well funded because of the air quality issue, and I think you've got to understand the air quality challenge in California to understand CARB's ambitions, because there is still a chronic problem with air quality on the south coast of California and in the San Joaquin Valley. And there's a lot of pressure politically to solve that problem. So CARB has support politically and funding. They've also got a lot of funding from the VW penalty fines that were paid. So they are piling in a lot of resources to looking at whether this can be achieved. But of course, there's concerns by manufacturers about the fragmentation of regulations. So one regulation in California and a few other states would be quite difficult for manufacturers to comply with if the EPA or federal regulations weren't following the same track. So there's a lot of pressure to somehow bring those discussions together. Very difficult in an environment where there's a Trump administration which is moving actively against regulation, pushing against anything new. As you've probably read, EPA pushed back on the 22 to 25 light duty CO2 standards. So they're certainly their philosophical position is against new regulation, but manufacturers are in favor. So that might politically make some kind of solution possible. Certainly the greenhouse gas standards in the US for trucks are not going to be pushed back because the industry is in favor of those standards. They were involved in developing them. But in Europe, here's the question. In Europe, based on that California experience and discussions in Europe about air quality in city centers, do you think we'll see some kind of ultra-low NOx standard? I'm thinking something around a 90% reduction. So the question is, will we see a steep reduction in the NOx emission standard for heavy duty by 2025 from the Commission? I'm not saying it'll be implemented by 2025. The question is, do you think it'll be agreed by 2025? Probably coming in 2030, somewhere around there. So do you think yes or no? Let's have an answer to that question, Ben. Okay. That reflects the fact that that is probably the most controversial question I've had in terms of opinion, I would guess, and that's going to come out later in the presentations. I do think that's a topic for some serious debate and discussion. So that I'm glad the results quite divided, because I don't think there's a clear answer on that question yet. The benefits of an ultra low NOx standard have to be heavily weighed against the CO2 and fuel efficiency impact. Okay, final question, and it's a kind of blue sky question, just to finish my presentation, because I think this, in terms of disruption, this could be something quite substantial to our industry. Autonomous trucks in particular, I think, could disrupt the industry quite substantially. I think in 10 years' time, we could be looking back and not even recognizing road transport. So what do you think? Do you think we'll see fully autonomous? Sorry, I should have had a timetable in here. The question is, there's a timetable in, sorry. The question is, when do you think we'll see fully autonomous trucks in commercial use in Europe, mainly heavy duty driving on highways, transport nodes, long distance travel? When do you think it's coming? I think we all recognize it's coming at some point. When do you think it's going to happen? Do you think it's going to be by 2025? I'm talking full autonomy here, level 5, independent trucks driving on their own. By 2025 or 2030, or do you think it's going to happen much later, after 2030? The reason I've put this question in is because I think it has many impacts. I've seen some studies that show that have estimated or assessed that autonomy on vehicles, trucks and cars will have a big impact on traffic flows. So there'll be a substantial reduction in urban congestion, which means much more efficient use of road capacity. So we could see more road transport, more goods transported by road in more efficient ways. Of course, taking the driver out the vehicle saves a substantial part of the cost and inconvenience and driving time regulation issues. So we could see heavy-duty trucks of some form traveling much more effectively across Europe, carrying goods, and therefore using many more engines and many more after-treatment systems and so on. On the other hand, perhaps other changes will come and there'll be less goods required, or people will behave differently. I don't know. There's many questions, but there's certainly room for autonomous trucks to completely revolutionize powertrain. And so my final question is, when do you think full autonomy is going to be introduced commercially? By 2025, by 2030, or by after 2030? Let's see, Ben. You think it's a long way away. I do. I think that's probably valid. It might be your children's children that look back and say they can't believe human beings ever drove vehicles, such dangerous vehicles along roads without assistance from autonomy. Right, my time's up. We've never done this before in Europe, this interactive kind of session, so I hope you've enjoyed it. And I think it helps to get a sense of where the audience is for the day. I hope, Penny, you have a sense of what people think about the future. Just a concluding remark is I think being involved in this industry, you certainly get overwhelmed sometimes by the press coverage. It's kind of relentless. Even last week, the Audi Stadler, the Audi CEO, was arrested. We know, and I think in some ways that gets to become a bit too much of a tunnel vision, and it does take away from some of the achievements that are being made by manufacturers. And we know from independent tests of trucks, of buses, of cars, that vehicles are cleaner than ever. We do know that many cars tested by emissions analytics and other groups are able to meet 40 milligrams per kilometer in terms of NOx, which is well within Euro 6, the final Euro 6 requirements. And I think it's worth shouting about some of the achievements more. In the end, ultimately, I think we all realize that the future is going to be a very diverse mix of technologies. There's no one solution fits all, absolutely not. Regulators understand that, industry understands that, but I think we need to focus on the science, I guess, and the evidence. And that will make the best outcome possible. Right, I don't have any more for you. I hope you've enjoyed that session. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you.